Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving straight into a massive historical mystery today, one that actually has a huge, direct impact on your financial future right now. We are currently living through the largest wealth transfer in human history. We're talking about absolute mountains of money, property, and assets changing hands from one generation to the next. But before we get into the reality of what's happening today, we really need to look at a story of how incredibly difficult it is to actually hold on to that wealth once it's handed down. $16 trillion. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. That staggering figure represents the missing billions from historic American families. Imagine families like the Vanderbilts, who received immense fortunes during an era when simply leaving your money in the right place would multiply it dozens of times over. And yet, today, that money has basically turned to dust. I want you to keep this 16 trillion figure in the back of your mind as we go, because it is literally the ultimate cautionary tale for the wealth transfer happening today. So, Part 1, the missing billionaires and the illusion of permanent wealth. Let's look at how these seemingly invincible fortunes just vanish. Take Cornelius Vanderbilt. The guy was once the richest man in the world thanks to railroads and shipping. He passes away in 1877, leaves behind this absolute mountain of cash, but makes one fatal error. He left zero instructions on how to actually manage it over time. By 1947, just 70 years later, there wasn't a single descendant whose wealth could be traced back to that original fortune. An ex-fund manager actually crunched the numbers on the 1900 US Census, which recorded about 4,000 millionaires. He figured out that if just a quarter of those families had started with $5 million, put it in the US stock market, and spent it reasonably, they should collectively hold around $16 trillion today. Yet that money is entirely missing. Now, you're probably thinking, well, they must have just made terrible investment choices. But that's not it at all. During that time, the US stock market was returning about 10% a year. It was the perfect environment for growth. The missing billionaires didn't fail because of what they bought, they failed because of how they behaved. They made three fatal errors: taking on way too much risk, aggressively overspending, and just acting as if the market would only ever go up. It wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was simply a lack of a disciplined system. Moving on to Part 2, the Great Transfer and the local reality in Italy. Because the crucial point here is that this isn't just some old American history lesson. It is happening right now, specifically in places like Italy on an absolutely massive scale. In Italy alone, it's estimated that between 2.3 and 6 trillion euros will pass from one generation to the next over the coming 2 decades. That is a staggering 120 to 160 billion euros every single year. And this wealth didn't just fall from the sky. It's largely built on real estate, homes bought by the boomer generation back when a house cost the equivalent of a single salary. Those properties exploded in value while wages basically flatlined. And keep in mind, this transfer doesn't just start with a funeral. It begins quietly, right at the dinner table, with parents chipping in for a first down payment or helping cover rent. This fundamentally shifts the economic landscape. Research from The Economist shows a highly counterintuitive reality. Inheritances actually matter much more in countries with stagnant economic growth. Look at Italy. In 1990, inheritances made up about 7% of the national income. By 2023, that number had nearly tripled to 19%. When a country's economy stops growing rapidly, like Italy's did in the mid-90s, the weight of inherited wealth becomes significantly heavier than the wealth generated by actual day-to-day labor. But hold on, before anyone starts planning a life of luxury, we need to address a harsh reality. 60% of the people expecting an inheritance will receive less than 5,000 euros. There's massive inequality in this transfer. Central bank data shows that the top 1% scoops up half of all transferred wealth. So, while more than half of young people expect an inheritance, only about 1 in 5 will actually see one. That is a massive gap, built entirely on false expectations. Which brings us to Part 3, the dispersion of wealth, or the generational bleed. This builds a pretty terrifying picture for those lucky enough to actually get a substantial inheritance. Because getting the money is only the easy part. Based on a rigorous 20-year study of over 3,000 wealthy families, the statistics are just brutal. 70% of families lose their wealth by the second generation. By the third generation, 90% have lost it. Why does this happen? Well, look at that last row. In Italy, 81% of heirs fire their family's financial advisor within the first year or two of inheriting. They completely discard the guidance that built the wealth over 30 years, often without having any personal financial knowledge or a system of their own to replace it. They just go with their gut, chase market trends, and spend as if the wind will never change direction. This incredible rate of dispersion leads into part 4, Boomer versus Millennial, the ideological divide. This is really the core conflict of our analysis today. Look at this massive generational disparity. In 2020, Boomers held roughly 57% of all wealth, while Millennials held a tiny 3%. We literally have two generations living in completely different economic realities. And this isn't just about who has the money, it fundamentally shifts the entire paradigm of how money itself is viewed and managed. We are looking at two entirely different economies here. For Boomers, capital was built on accessible real estate, where a home could be purchased with just a few years of salary. On the flip side, for Millennials, rent aggressively consumes an entire paycheck. So when the wealth finally passes from the generation on the left to the generation on the right, it's not just a name change on a bank account. It is a full-on collision of financial philosophies. And that philosophical shift leads us directly to part 5, the crypto protest, and a crisis of trust. This is the real dinner table battleground. Because nothing highlights this conflict quite like the debate over alternative investments. The data shows us something completely unprecedented. Young people who inherit wealth are moving heavily away from traditional banking. While the global average for alternative asset allocation is normally around 15%, younger generations are dumping up to 61% of their portfolios into alternative assets, private equity, real estate, and crypto. Why? Because they are deeply scarred. Many of them were coming of age right around 2008. They watched the traditional banking system melt down and then saw the very institutions that caused the crisis get bailed out. This gets to the very heart of the generational divide. To a boomer, allocating wealth into something like cryptocurrency looks entirely reckless, a gamble, a passing fad, or even a scam. But to a millennial, neutrally looking at the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis, they view these alternative assets as a form of protest. It's a statement of independence and a profound distrust in the traditional financial system. It is a completely different worldview. This quote right here, "I manage my money myself," perfectly captures the protest of the younger generation. It emphasizes that this massive shift into riskier alternative assets isn't exclusively about chasing insane returns. It is deeply rooted in a crisis of trust. It's a generation deciding that they would rather take on the risk themselves than hand their newly inherited wealth over to a system they feel completely failed them in the past. Which brings us to our final section, owner or custodian, the ultimate mindset shift. Here is the catch. Regardless of whether you trust the traditional banking system or prefer alternative assets, and regardless of which generation you belong to, preventing the loss of this wealth requires a fundamental shift in personal identity. The difference between losing a fortune and keeping it boils down to one choice: being an owner versus a custodian. An owner looks at an inheritance and thinks, "Awesome, this is mine to do with as I please." They spend based on what they hope the market will return. If they have $1 million and expect 7%, they start spending $70,000 immediately. When a bad year hits, and it always does, they don't adjust. They just keep spending until the ship sinks. A custodian, however, thinks this money is passing through me. They manage risks strictly. They link their spending to the actual reality of the market, not a fantasy. And their primary goal is to preserve and grow that wealth for the person who comes next. So as we stand on the edge of this unprecedented historical wealth transfer, the lesson from those missing billionaires to modern inheritors is exactly the same. It's not just about what you inherit. It is entirely about who you choose to become. I leave you with this vital question. When the time comes, will you act as an owner and consume the legacy, or will you step up as a custodian and protect it for the next generation?